So my name is Stephanie Maroney, and I've been leading these building community ferment workshops for a few years now, since 2018. And all the time I've been in, happy collaboration with the library, with the Yolo County Public Library, our Davis branch, and am forever grateful for Joan's help in setting up this Zoom and helping advertise and get the word out about the event. So I always just want to say how grateful I am to get to work with the library and all of the great stuff that they do for our community. So that's wonderful. I love working with the library too, because that means that this workshop is always free. And I think, that's an important part of why I wanted to start it. Is it's just a place that I developed the workshop in the first place to be somewhere where people could just come if they were curious about fermentation. It's not about a place to become experts or to know more about it than somebody else, although hopefully you will learn a little more about it by being in the workshop. But I really want Building Community Ferment to be a space where we can experiment and be creative and try new things, and know that there's not any kind of penalty for doing that. And that's my approach as well. So I think of myself not as, an expert that is going to share my expertise with you, but rather I'm also somebody who is practicing fermentation, food fermentation, and I still have a lot of curiosity about it. And I still, try new things and fail and learn from those experiences. So I welcome you all in that same spirit with curiosity and some sense of adventure as we explore this world together of fermentation. I have a couple logistical things to share. The first is that please use the chat function on our Zoom call, and you can put questions in there. You feel free to use it at any time. If I'm saying something that you have a question about, I have it open on my screen, so I will check the chat as we go through in case anybody wants me to address something that comes up. I also wanted to, I'll put it in there right now, share the email address that I use for this workshop. It's communityferment@gmail.com. And you can use that email address to get in touch with me if you ever have a question about fermentation, whether it's something we talked about in the workshop or just a general question. If I have the time, I'm happy to reply or connect you to some other resources that I might know. Another important thing with that email address is you can use that to send me an email afterwards with your address, because I make kits. I have a grant from UC Davis. They have in the Global Affairs program, they gave me a small amount of money that I use to create little kits for everybody so that you can do it at home. So the idea is that by attending the workshop, you learn a little bit about how to get started, and then I can deliver a kit to you that has everything for you to try it out yourself. So you are welcome to private chat me your address, or you can send me an email to communityferment@gmail.com, and I will follow up with you this weekend, is usually when I go do my deliveries of kits. So that was another important piece of information to just keep that in mind, to make sure I have your address so you can get a kit. This is kind of a strange moment, because the workshop obviously used to be in person, like a lot of things in our lives. It was at the library, and it really was a community experience, collaborative community experience. And we've had to move online, obviously, like a lot of things in life. And it was about this time last year that I did my first online workshop, which was also on sourdough. So it's come full circle. Here we are a year later. And I will be offering one more workshop in this online format, because I'm kind of fingers crossed that maybe this summer I'll be able to do something with small groups outside and take it out of the online format. If that's not possible, I'll probably continue online, but because I love doing it, but I would love to do it in person with other people. So you can save the date right now for the last kind of online event, which will be on April 14th from 4 to 5 p.m. and that will be a workshop on brining whole vegetables. So I've done ones with like shredded cabbage and other kinds of veggies, but this one will be making a kind of salty brine that you can use to, quote unquote, pickle whole veggies. And then so that one will be in April 14th from 4 to 5. But today we're talking about sourdough. So sourdough it's kind of been everywhere since the pandemic. I feel like one of the first things I saw was people experimenting with baking sourdough bread at home, or looking up new recipes. And there was this whole, kind of cultural moment of pandemic baking, and people were rediscovering sourdough, which is really neat. It's fun to see that expand. But of course, I've let you all know before, I'm no expert and I don't really make sourdough bread. It's kind of hard. So kudos to anybody out there who has been able to make some sourdough bread. I can't. It really takes some special attention and some kind of special time and equipment. And I don't have that kind of space in my life right now. So, but I still like to make sourdough. And that's what I'm going to talk with you about today. Oh, getting a phone call. So I'm going to talk about that with you today, about how we can use sourdough, make a sourdough starter, and use it in things that aren't necessarily bread. Although what we make today, you could use for bread as well. It's totally interchangeable, but it's up to you based on what you want to do. Sourdough is, maybe it's a word we're all kind of familiar with now, but it really was the only way people made bread before we had commercially available yeast strains, which is usually what like bakers will use now. They'll just kind of like add, or you even yourself, if you go to the store, you buy dried yeast and you would add that to a baking project. So that we know that wasn't always the case for sure in terms of how people made bread. And so most all humans cultures would make bread or a natural levain using the yeast that are already in the air and already on materials like ground flour or grains that they would use to make the bread. So sourdough, although it's kind of trendy right now, it is one of the kind of oldest human practices around cultivating microorganisms in our environment and using them to make delicious products like bread or like crackers, or I will end up using a sourdough starter to show you how to make a sourdough pancake, like a savory veggie sourdough pancake. So there's lots of use for this. And one of the reasons why I'm drawn to fermentation as a practice is because it's something that human beings have done for a really long time. And it's it's having a moment in our culture. There's a lot more talk about fermentation and fermented foods, and you maybe see things in the grocery store now that you didn't see 5-10 years ago. But know that it is something that people have done for a very, very, very long time. And it's kind of an exciting thing for me to think about how by re-engaging in these practices, we can maybe reconnect with our elders and with our ancestors through our own culturally specific practices of fermentation, because fermentation, like other culturally significant art forms, like music, like dance, like clothing, like, religious practices, I mean, they are highly revered and beloved by people and their communities. And certainly fermented foods hold that same space in cultures around the world. Just saw a quick note that said, is this being recorded? Yes, it is. And I will make sure everyone here gets a link afterwards if you want to revisit the video. And just real quick for folks who've joined, hello, my name's Stephanie, and you should feel free to use the chat to ask questions, and make sure to either privately message me your address or send me an email at communityferment@gmail.com, and I will make sure you get a free kit after the workshop so that you can do your own sourdough experiment at home. Cool. All right. So let's get rolling here. Sourdough is pretty basic in terms of how you can do it as a fermented project. Some of the things I make, like I've had a kombucha workshop, so a little more complicated. There's more moving parts. You need some special things, but when it comes to sourdough, you just need flour and water, and that is all you need. Sometimes people use starters from other people, so you may have encountered this, or you may have heard of this, but some people claim that they're using, a 200-year-old starter that's been passed down from generation to generation. And that's really cool, but you don't need that to get started. You just need flour and water, and that's it. So it's pretty cool when you hear, I think it's cool when you hear stories about how people do use these old starters, or have one that's been passed down through their family or friends, or etc. But it's not necessary to become somebody who makes sourdough. So I'm going to demonstrate to you today a way that you can get started without having to rely on, an heirloom sourdough starter, so to speak. Like I said, we're not going to make bread, but I am going to show you how you can make a sourdough pancake with some vegetables, but also with kitchen scraps. So, I always find I've got a family of 4, got 2 kids who eat a lot. And I find that I always end up having little bits of like, let's see, I'll show you later, but like I got a little bit of hominy. I have some rice, some little bit of greens left over from something, like 2 carrots, and it's a great way to use up some of these kind of leftovers, is to turn them into these savory sourdough pancakes. So I will show you that at the end of this presentation. All right, so in terms of getting started, like I said, the things that you will need are flour and water. Basically, those are your only materials. The other thing that you need is some kind of a vessel for the starter. So you can use a glass jar, and actually everybody who signs up to receive a kit, you'll get one of these. It's a 32-ounce glass jar, and it has this wide rim, which makes it easier for like getting your hand in there and stirring it up. So I'll make sure everyone gets one of these in your kit. If you don't have a jar like that, that's totally fine. You can use a glass, like a drinking glass. You can use I always save like old spaghetti sauce jars because they're just endlessly useful. And you could start it in there. You could also use plastic, totally fine, on Tupperware container, whatever you use. The only thing around fermentation is I tend to say not to use stainless steel or metal containers, because part of what we're doing in that environment is we're creating acidity because of the work of the bacteria and yeast. They make the environment more acidic, and sometimes that can have a reaction with the metal. It's not going to like destroy your metal bowl, but you might end up getting some off flavors in your ferment. So the advice I've read and what I practice is just to use glass or plastic or ceramic, materials, basically natural non-reactive materials. So for my purposes, I'm going to use this glass jar. And the basic process that we're going to do here is we're going to mix flour and water about equal parts, flour and water. And we're going to do that in a way that the yeast that is naturally on the grain when it gets ground into flour, as well as the yeast that's kind of floating in the air right now, we're going to use that as the starter to create this fermentation, to create the activity of fermentation. And the yeast are going to eat the flour, basically. And by digesting it, they're going to give us this bubbly, active, we're basically feeding yeast. That's kind of all we're doing here with a sourdough starter. And you can do that just with the flour itself, but I will show you and describe some different things you can do to get the sourdough starter kind of jump started if you need that. Because like all things fermentation, temperature really matters, whether it's hot in your house or cold in your house. The season tends to matter. So it's very hard to say, oh yeah, that'll definitely be done in 3 days. Because I don't know what temperature your home is. I don't know, what the flour you're using. So it's always going to be varying in terms of when you'll see something that's active that you can use. So I was going to read a little bit for you first before I do my own, because one of the people that I use in a lot of my fermentation work is the author Sander Katz. And he's written a couple books on fermentation. This one is kind of an encyclopedia-y book called The Art of Fermentation. He has another book called Wild Fermentation that I really like. But he has this moment here where he describes sourdough called Starting One and Maintaining It. And I'm going to read it to you because I think it gives an outline of the whole process, pretty straightforward. And he's a good writer. So he writes, the simplest way of starting a sourdough from scratch is to mix a small amount of flour and water in a bowl, a little more flour than water, and stir until smooth. Add a little more water or flour as necessary to obtain a batter that is liquid and pourable, yet thick enough to cling to a spoon. Rye flour seems to work fastest, but you can make sourdough with the flour of any grain. Be sure that the water is un- or dechlorinated. Press out any lumps of the flour so that the batter is smooth. It should be thick enough to cling to the spoon or to your hands, and to soon hold little foamy bubbles. Stir it at least once a day for a few days until you see bubbles on the surface. Then feed it a high proportion of fresh flour, adding roughly 3 to 4 times as much flour and water to the remaining starter. High proportion feedings like this reduce the acidity of the sourdough environment and give yeast a competitive advantage. It's a good way to build sourdough vigor. So that's the kind of basic outline that we're going to do here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of the different points here, kind of explain a little bit to you as I go through making it and expanding on some of the stuff that Katz says. So in terms of flour, I actually went to the co-op and I got some rye flour. So if you wanted to use the rye flour that Katz is saying is very reactive, you could go to our local co-op and you could buy some. I think this was maybe it was $3.50, or maybe it was $3.50 pound. That's what it was. So I think it was about $8. But this is rye flour, and it looks kind of like regular, maybe whole wheat flour. It's got some speckles in it, but it's made from the grain rye. I also got some whole wheat flour. So this is stone ground whole wheat flour, meaning it uses all parts of the grain, the wheat grain, and isn't bleached or kind of over processed afterwards. The other option, and all these work just as well, it's not a preference at all, is what you could call, all-purpose flour. And this might be the one you have in your house because you use it for all kinds of things, right? So you could use just a regular white flour, all-purpose flour. You could be bleached or unbleached, doesn't really matter. I just bought these because these are the ones that I will give to you when you start your own. And I know I've said it pretty clearly, I'm not making bread, but if you want to make bread, I definitely encourage you to go to the King Arthur Flours website. So King Arthur is a brand of flour, but their website is actually a wonderful resource for making and baking sourdough bread. So if you're someone who wants to know more about that process, I would just send you over to their website and you could find some really cool videos and descriptions of step-by-step processes for making sourdough bread. Yeah. So you could use any kind of flour you want. I'm going to go ahead and start this one for you with the rye flour because it's open and it's here. So again, it's not about, you don't have to measure it at all, but Katz is just telling us to do about equal amounts, but a little bit more flour. So I just have like this scoop here. And what I'm going to end up doing with this is I'm going to end up having to feed it more. So maybe don't fill the whole jar up with flour to start. You start with maybe a little bit because you're going to have to increase it as you go because you're going to give the yeast more things to eat because they're going to eat through this flour pretty quickly. So this is just kind of round one. Okay, so I did that much flour in it. Now I have some water. And now this is filtered water that I got, like from one of those machines at the grocery store. But you could also buy filtered water. Or you could, use a filter on your tap water. That's totally fine. if you don't have access to any of those and you only have tap water, you can pour tap water like into a bowl. And if you leave it out overnight, the chlorine will actually mostly evaporate. So if you are somebody who doesn't have access to dechlorinated water, just use tap water, but leave it out overnight or maybe 24 hours, and the chlorine can evaporate naturally and it'll be fine to use. It's also not the end of the world if you use chlorinated water either. It's just kind of how people have talked about this process in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and pour what is a little less than half of the amount of flour of the water in there. And the other tool you're going to want is a fork, because using a spoon, I found it just all clumps on the end of it. So it's actually easier to use a fork. It's a better tool for this. And I have one of these, but it's this really long fork that I like to use because I can, keeps my hand above the jar. So I'm going to just stir now. And you can see, the pieces of flour there that are stuck to the edge. So I'm going to make sure to get those all incorporated, and then kind of scrape along the side of the jar to incorporate all those flour clumps, and just kind of stir it up. And what Katz was saying as well is you can kind of press the fork against the side of the jar to break up any flour clumps. It's not biscuit batter, so you really want it incorporated and you want all of that flour to be wet, to absorb the water and to, not have any pockets of dry flour in there. All right, that looks pretty good. So I'll show you what it looks like. It's definitely sticking to the spoon or to the fork. I think this is fine. This might even be a little thick, so I could put a little bit more water in there if I wanted. Something like a thick pancake batter is what you're going for. So not runny, but this one is almost like, I don't know, it's a little too thick. So I'm gonna stir that up, and it looks a little, it definitely looks, it's a little runnier. You can see with what I did. So that's it. I've incorporated it all, put my dirty fork away, and now I have the beginning of my sourdough starter. Oh, there's a great message about water. You can also boil the water for 15 minutes to get the chlorine out. Yeah, beautiful. That accelerates that evaporation process by heating it up. So perfect. Another way to dechlorinate water is to boil it. Cool. All right, so we've got a little bit of flour, a little bit of water mixed up here. So now I'm going to leave it to begin that process of fermentation. So you can, I find that you don't need to screw a tight top on here because it's okay. It's actually, we want to have an exchange of air and microbes and yeast in here to get it going. But we also don't want any bugs or things to climb in there. So you could use, like I have this one here that I'll show you. This is just a paper towel, the rubber band around it. That would be a fine lid. You could also use a piece of fabric if you have like a towel. That's fine, just like that. You don't even need a rubber band on it. But just to basically keep it kind of covered so that things don't fly in there that you don't want to eat eventually. So what I would do is I have a little, I guess like a shelving unit here that I keep a lot of my ferments on. And so it's in my kitchen, which is a warmer spot of my house because we do cooking in here and sometimes the oven's on. And that's usually where I just leave them. I just put them over there. It's also not tucked away in a corner because we're gonna wanna revisit this and stir it. So you don't wanna put it in your cabinet and like forget about it, So it's nice to have it out somewhere where you'll remember it, where it can have access to some good warmth or the heat of your home, but not necessarily in direct sunlight because it might get too hot in that space. Yeah, cheesecloth. Saw that in the chat. That's another great thing. It's a super useful kitchen tool, So if you have some cheesecloth, which sometimes can have a very wide weave on it, so you can just fold it in half if it's a little too wide, but that's perfect. You could put a piece of cheesecloth on top. And it looks cute too with the cheesecloth on top. So yeah, if I was going to stop now, which I'm not because I'm demoing for you, I would just go put this away, right? But let's say 24 hours has passed. So it's been another 24 hours. I'm gonna pull this out. I'll take the lid off. And what we can't see here, but what I can describe to you, what you would see within 24 hours, is you would see some bubbles, because the bubbles are the signs of activity from the yeast that are digesting the flour. So you'd see some bubbles, and you might also see a layer of water, of liquid, forming along the top of your mix. And that's totally fine. That's just a byproduct of the yeast doing their thing. And what they're breaking down that flour. And so you're going to end up with kind of more liquid. And at that point, some people say you need to dump out half of what you have and kind of refeed it. But I don't think you have to do that, especially if you're using a jar where you have more space to do it. But what you would want to do now, because you're getting ready to use it, you want it to be very active, is you would do that thing that Sandra Cass was saying called the high proportion feeding. So now we're going to kind of just really jumpstart the yeast, because they're already hungry. We got them started eating already. And now we're going to add almost 3 times as much to just get it going. So you could add the same flour, you could add different flour. It honestly doesn't matter at this point. Just any flour that you have works fine. So I'm going to go ahead and just open the white flour actually. And find my, I lost my scoop. Okay, so I will do a high proportion feeding, meaning I'm going to do almost 3 times as much. So I'm going to put quite a bit of flour in here. And it's been, it's been 24 hours, let's say. So I know that it's active because I can see bubbles on it. And I'm going to go ahead and add the water to this again. And now it's looking pretty full. And I'll do the same stirring thing that I did before, where I incorporate it and make sure it's all the flour clumps are out of there, and mix it in with the old stuff. Just have it be all one big mix. And then basically I'll mix this really, really well. And what would happen is I would leave this again overnight, maybe 2 days, because we gave it quite a bit of flour to use or to eat. So it might need 2 days, might not need just 1. But you'll know it's ready because it will be so active in terms of bubbles rather. It will not look like pancake batter. This looks, pretty thick, like pancake batter. It will have big bubbles in it, and you'll be able to see the bubbles forming along the side of the jar. And honestly, I filled this a little high. This would probably overflow. So that's another thing. So if you're going to put it somewhere and it's getting pretty near the top, put it on a plate or in a bowl, something like that, just in case it does, overflow. So yeah, I would move this. Again, I put my lid on it or my cloth or whatever, and I would move it to its safe space. And every day I would stir it, because the stirring helps to activate or it helps to kind of circulate the material that's in there to feed the yeast. It also helps bring in new yeast and bacteria from the air, and it just kind of gets everything excited. That's my very scientific explanation of that. Gets everything very excited. So once you're stirring that every day, you should see the activity, the bubbles, maybe the overflowing within 2 to 3 days if it's a warmer day. If it's cold, it might take more time than that. But the weather's changing, so I would say about 2 to 3 days, keep an eye on it. And you can have something then that you're ready to use. So you could use that in making bread. Usually most bread recipes call for like a cup of starter. And this is what that would be at that point. This would be your starter if you're looking at bread recipes. Or like I'll show you, this could be the beginning of pancake batter. You can just use this straight up as pancake batter. If you wanted to make sweet pancakes, you could add some sugar to it, some eggs, baking soda, whatever you want. Or since I'm going to use savory ones, I wouldn't add that. But this is basically now pancake batter that's ready to use right out of the jar. I'm going to just show you one that I had made before. So I was hoping it'd be a lot more vigorous, but it was actually kind of cold last night, so it's not very warm. But this is one that I made a few days ago, It smells really nice too. That's one way you can tell if it's ready is it doesn't just smell like, wheat paste, like flour water. It has this like sharpness and this sourness to it, like a good sourdough bread. So I'm going to try to actually move my camera and see if you can see on the inside. Kind of, you see a few bubbles on the top there. So there's not a ton of them, but there are some little bubbles that are forming, which makes me, which to me means that the yeast is doing its thing, and it's quite liquid. It's much more liquid. Actually, I'll show you. You can see that it's a lot more liquid than that one was, and it actually becomes a little like glutinous as well too, kind of stringy. And that's just what happens as the yeast digest. They really change the properties of the flour itself. So it gets kind of sticky. It's really fascinating, honestly. It's like I didn't add anything to this but flour and water, and yet you see all of these neat activity happening as a result of it. So this one, I would say, needs another day before it's ready to be used as a sourdough starter. I fed it pretty well this morning, so I think it just needs some more time to get going. But this one is, a day ahead of that one, so I'd say just another day, and I could use it how I want to. And I used whole wheat flour for this one. The other one I wanted to show you is, this is a sourdough starter that I've had in the back of my fridge since April of 2020. So this was the one that I used in my workshop last year, and I just put it in the back of my fridge. So you can see that it looks, I made it with white flour, but do you see that liquid on the top? I'll open it up too and you can see it. See what this one, ooh, that does not smell like flour. That smells like a little bit like alcohol and a little bit like cheese. It's got some really interesting flavors to it, but you can see the liquid that formed on the top there, see? And that's fine, that's totally normal. And the liquid's a little bit gray. Sometimes that liquid is like grayish. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You can mix it right back into it. So this has been in my fridge for a year, but it is still alive. It's not dead. It's not garbage. It's not waste. It can be used right now to make some sourdough. So I'm going to feed it actually here, and let's get it going again. So I'll use my flour that I bought, and I'm going to start with just a little bit of flour, not that high proportion feeding, right? That's kind of the second step. So I just want to wait. I want to wake it up a little bit. So I'm going to give it a scoop of flour, and then I'm going to give it a little bit of water, a little less water. And I'm going to incorporate this new flour into this year-old sourdough starter that has been sitting in the back of my fridge. And that's something you can do as well. Sourdough, once it gets ready to be used, when it's very active and bubbly, you kind of got to use it, because that means that the yeast are really active and they're ready to make you bread or whatever. But you want to use it at that point, but you can keep it. You don't have to, use it and you lose it, so to speak. You can basically give it a good feeding, like give the yeast something to eat, and then you can put it in the refrigerator, because that cold weather the yeast go dormant basically. It's not an active environment for them, so they just kind of go to sleep. And you reactivate them by bringing them out of that cold environment and giving them something to eat. And then they will become, more active, and I can use this again in another project. So there you go. I gave it some food. You can see I probably doubled the size of it with the flour that I added to it. And I'm just going to put this to the side. I'll get another lid for it, and I'll stir it whenever I walk by it. And then maybe tomorrow, once I start to see some bubbles and activity, I'll give it that high proportion feeding. So like almost 3 times as much as I did now. And that will jumpstart it so that it's ready to be used in some way. And yeah, see, it smells really nice now. Even just with that flour, it was enough to kind of balance out what was a pretty strong smell before that. Okay, so now you can kind of see these different models. You know, this is like a white flour one that's a year old. This is a wheat flour one that's 2 days old. And then this is the rye flour one that we just made right now. And so they are all pretty dormant at the moment. They need some more time. But if you don't want to sit around and wait for the yeast to get busy, there are other things you can do to start the fermentation process. So one of those is using honey. So when you're making your initial sourdough, or your starter, sorry, with the flour and the water, you can add just a little bit of honey. It doesn't even need, you don't need a big glop of it. Just like dip your spoon in some honey, or your fork. Dip your fork in honey, just like this. Like that's even too much. It can be just like that. Just a honey coated fork, right? And then use that to stir it up. And then you'll incorporate it all together. The flour, the water, and the honey. And the honey, yeast loves sugar. So you're basically just giving them something to start their appetite like immediately. So that gets them going, and then they'll start to work on the flour next. So that's also a great one to start. So this one has a little bit of honey, and I find that when I use honey, definitely within a day, it's ready to go, right? It brings that waiting window down from like 3 days to 1 day. You could also use a piece of fruit that serves the same effect. And the other thing you get when you add a piece of fruit is you get the yeast that are on the fruit as well, which helps to start it up. So you could drop a strawberry or a grape or whatever you want in there, and that will provide the sugar and the yeast to the sourdough, and you would just remove that piece of fruit before you went to use it for something. And the final option, kind of, you know, in the middle ground between a fruit and honey, is like a raisin. So many people, I mean, I think in France, there's a tradition of using a raisin in the sourdough starters. So again, it's like that concentrated sweetness that the yeast will like, and probably it brings its own yeast as a dried fruit to the, you know, flower party that's going on in here. So if you need to speed up the process, I recommend a little bit of honey, a piece of fresh fruit, probably not like a banana or something, or an orange, which is very acidic, but like a berry. That tends to work really well. A grape or a berry, or a raisin. Those are kind of tried and true methods of jump starting your sourdough process. That is basically all I have to show you for getting the sourdough started. It's flour, it's water, it's time, it's lots of mixing. And when you are getting to the point where you want to use it, just make sure to do that high proportion feeding. So once you see some activity, that's when you give it a lot more to eat. And then you'll have the starter to work with. So I'll show you one thing that I like to do with it. You can, and yeah, just maybe one last thing about that. I mentioned it a little bit, but I have it in my notes. If you want to keep it, right, you can just keep it in your refrigerator, again, to help slow down the activity of the yeast. And you maybe feed it once before you go. Other people, they've said you can freeze it. I haven't tried that before, but that could be a fun thing to experiment with this time, is you just freeze it in a baggie or something. Or as you know, there's lots of stories about how people actually dried out their sourdough starters. And there are stories about people, you know, coming to the United States from Eastern Europe or something, and wiping their sourdough starter on a handkerchief and drying it out and putting the handkerchief in their pocket, you know, and then when you get to your new place, you can scrape that dried sourdough off, give it some flour and water, and it comes alive again. It's quite amazing, you know, the journeys that that yeast can make, and it can be reactivated very quickly. So you could experiment with drying it out, freezing it, or just putting it in the back of your refrigerator. Any of those would work. All right, I've got a few minutes, so I'll show you what I like to do with them, which is make these savory pancakes. So The way I start that is I usually get like a glass bowl or a ceramic bowl, again, plastic, again, just not metal. And I think of veggies that I like in a savory pancake. So for me, that would be a potato or a sweet potato. I have some radish. I have carrots and beets. I like all those things in my savory pancakes. And these ones in particular, they're kind of hearty root vegetables. And I'm going to add them now in this first process because basically, I'll shred a little bit of them just to should demonstrate. I like to use a shredder or a grater because it helps to keep things all uniform, and it allows for kind of equal cooking when I do go to cook these. Get a big chunk of carrot, you know, it would take forever for it to cook. So I'm gonna shred up a little bit of each of my veggies. Actually, just gonna do potato, carrot, and radish in this one. And you can see that I get this like kind of shredded vegetable mix, right? Okay, so now to my shredded vegetables, I'm going to add my sourdough starter right on top. Okay, so I'm gonna pour it in here enough to coat the vegetables entirely in the sourdough mix. So I'll kind of mix it together. And basically now this just looks like pancake batter, but with veggies in it, see? So all of the vegetables are covered. They're not sticking out. Now, this is what I would do the night before because I can leave it out overnight now. Again, I'll use my cloth to cover the top of it. It doesn't need to be plastic wrap or anything like that. But this has my sourdough starter and some shredded like hard root veggies. And I'm gonna leave this overnight because what'll happen is the activity of the microbes will get going again. You can put a little flour in it also at this time to help jumpstart your yeast. But they're also gonna now break down or start to digest the veggies that we put in there. So tomorrow they won't be hard, they'll actually be softened because they'll be kind of pre-digested by the microbes. So let's pretend it's been 24 hours and I bring it back out and I've got the mix with the veggies and it's going to smell great. It's going to smell savory and a little bit of the sourness, and the vegetables will no longer smell, you know, bland. They will be really activated, especially radish. You know, that always smells great when you ferment it. It's very strong. And then I have this kind of second step because now I'm going to cook them and eat them today. So this is when you can add other things like your leftovers. I mean, this is the most versatile. It's just a batter. You could put whatever you like to eat in it. So maybe I'll put a little bit of this hominy in it and have a little bit of rice. So grains work well. If you have anything that's left over, again, just like a little tiny bit of it is perfect. Beans, I've used like some leftover black eyed peas ones. Totally doesn't matter there. The other thing I like to do is I'll chop up some greens. So like these are beet greens, but you can use whatever you have in your house. Spinach, arugula, whatever you like the taste of. And I'll chop that up with some onion and I'll cook that first, like separately. Then you can add it into the mix, right? So I have some cooked greens in here. And then the last step, once you get all the veggies that you want in there, the grains, the beans, whatever, then I like to make it not vegan. So up until this point, it's vegan. Those folks can enjoy it. But now I like to change it up a little bit. And actually, if you wanted to keep it vegan, you could just add some more flour so that the batter is nice and thick. If not, it'll really spread. But since I'm not vegan and I want to thicken it up, I'm going to add cheese. So I'll put maybe like a cup of shredded cheese in here, maybe less than that if it's not too much. And then crack an egg and add some salt and pepper, whatever you like, and give the whole thing another good mix. And you end up with something that is quite thicker than the original mix. So if you end up needing a little bit more water, that's fine, or vice versa. If it ends up being watery for whatever reason, you can just add more flour. And then you basically just take your batter and plop it down on a hot skillet and cook it like a pancake. And I love these because they, I mean, it's the kids like them, and it's a nice way to kind of bring more vegetables into our life in interesting ways. And I love it because I get to use my sourdough starter, and it tastes like nothing else I've eaten. You know, it has a really unique flavor, and you get the opportunity to customize it however you want with whatever you like to eat. And I just find it's a nice vehicle for using up all of those little leftovers that you don't know what to do with. It's another kind of great opportunity to do that with. Um, that's about it. I think that's my sourdough. I wish, you know, I should have made a batter last night so I could cook one off and show it to you. But they come out really nice and tasty. But the kind of main thing we've done here is worked with making the sourdough starter itself. And once you start this process, you can definitely get on the internet and look for different kinds of recipes because they really are endless. I've seen people doing sourdough bagels, doing sourdough English muffins. I mean, all kinds of baking projects that aren't necessarily making a whole loaf of bread. You know, there's some easy, lower barrier to entry sourdough baking projects that you could undertake. Are there any questions that you all have for me about sourdough or about sourdough starters? I can kind of got my eye on the chat here, or you're welcome to also unmute yourself and ask. Happy to answer a question there. Oh yeah, could you please recap how you did your starter? Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, for folks who kind of came midway through, it's very, very easy. You add equal parts. Well, you add flour and water almost equal. So a little bit more flour because you're going for a consistency that's almost like a really thick pancake batter. And that's it. You just mix flour and water together. When you first start it off, if you won't get bubbles because you're just mixing the flour and the water together, and then you leave it for 24 hours. And over that time, what you'll start to get is some bubbles. You'll start to see those forming. You might see some liquid forming on the top of the jar as well. And you can just stir it again and reincorporate all of that back into it. And then you, when you're getting ready to use it, you give it what I was calling the high proportion feeding. All that means is you just give it almost 3 times as much flour as you originally did. And you mix that up very, very well with more water if needed to get that kind of thick pancake-like batter consistency. And then you wait another 2 or 3 days until you see some really nice bubbles happening, because that means that your starter is ready to go. And at that point, you can use it in lots of different things, like sourdough bread or like the sourdough pancake that I was talking about. Sweet potato, butternut squash are excellent additions to the batter and those are again like hard ones. So you could use that in that first step, add the batter to it and let it ferment overnight. Someone said zucchini or squash. Yeah, zucchini and squash also work really well. They have a high water content. So sometimes I think I've done it both ways. I've added them at the first step and let them ferment overnight. But I've also added them at the second step right before I cook them, and they both come out well because zucchini, you know, it cooks so fast when you shred it anyway. It doesn't really need to cook overnight or ferment overnight, but it's very tasty. They both work well. Great. Oh, someone says I make bread weekly and then muffins and crackers and bagels with my discard. Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. Wow, right on. So I want to make crackers too. Somebody was telling me about a cool recipe that they had for sourdough crackers. And again, it just seems a little easier than bread and bagels, but that's wonderful that you have such a great practice with your sourdough. And it is, I've heard this from people too, is it's like, you kind of get in a rhythm with it because you start to feed it and then it's ready. So you're like, oh, I gotta do something with it. So you make something and then you have a little bit left over. So you feed it and then it's ready and you do something with it. And you end up getting in this kind of rhythm with your sourdough starter. when it's ready to go, you make something with it. And that's part of the fun of fermentation, is you are actually interacting with like a living thing, and you get to make something creative with it based on its schedule. Great. Someone said I've made savory pancakes with chickpea flour, but I haven't fermented it first. Yeah, give it a try. It works with any kind of grain. That would be awesome. But there's also a dosa, which is a South Asian fermented. Oh, we have a friend who just also posted something about this. So dosa is fermented with rice and lentil batter, and you grind it up and ferment it and make these delicious, yeah, pancake like tasty treats. And then someone also is saying, Zan is saying that in South India, they make something very similar with rice flour and black gram flour, and make a fermented savory pancakes. That's called uthapam. I think I'm saying that right. Probably not saying it right. But yeah, I mean, there's so many different, there's such a diversity of, the pancake is a pretty universal, culturally universal, food item. And so many people use fermented grains to make those pancakes, because again, it helps to break down the grains as well. So for folks who have some, not if you have celiac disease, but if you have some gluten sensitivities, pre-fermenting the grains can help you digest it better. So, which is also why people can sometimes tolerate sourdough bread if they don't tolerate other kinds of bread. So it'd be the same case with these fermented grain products, whether that's a pancake or a dosa or other kinds of fermented treats.